Hello, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about late game optimizations and ways to get the most out of your end game by adjusting your board with either higher cost units or synergies that really matter for your particular comp. If you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. I usually do a daily TFT guide. Occasionally I'll also do some other stuff like patch reviews and some reaction content to like new dev drops and things like that. But I do a daily TFT video, so if you're interested in TFT or interested in set 14 and trying to level up your gameplay a little bit, please make sure to check out my channel and like and subscribe. And if you're a returning viewer, it's free, so please make sure to do that. We're also working our sub goal. We're getting close to 10,000 subs. There will be an RP giveaway at 10,000 subs for all the subscribers, so if you want to get in early on that, you can go ahead and start subscribing now. Okay, let's talk about spiking now. So in TFT, there's a concept of spiking your board, and what that usually means is finding some way to make your board stronger. You have to usually understand what your comp needs and what units can kind of help for the success of the particular comp. There's some comps that are super stable at certain levels, and there's some comps where there is a large spike that comes from hitting another unit later in the game. So for example, let's take a board like Amp, for example. Amp, a lot of times like 1, 2, and 3 amp and 4 amp, they kind of have like a relatively similar levels of like progressively making your board a little bit stronger, but there is a large spike that comes from hitting a Samira and getting to 5 amp, because not only do you get the extra, amp resource bonus that helps you out, you get a large chunk of HP that makes your board a lot tankier, and Samira with 5 amp is a huge power spike in terms of the amount of damage that you can do. Equivalently, if you take another type of board, let's just talk about a bread and butter style board, which is Marksman Vanguard. A lot of times Marksman Vanguard, however, is very stable at a certain level, right? Like if you're playing Marksman Vanguard, it looks something like this, and then your Vanguard units look like this. Bang. This is a board that is very stable at level 8, for example, and even leveling to 9 or even 10, there's not large synergies or units that are going to make this board dramatically stronger, so a lot of times it's very worthwhile to play more in the level where you're finding these upgrades and you're not having a huge spike by one particular unit or one particular synergy. Your main spike is the 4 Vanguard and 4 Marksman that you hit when you play 4 Vanguard, 4 Marksman. That's why it's this type of comp, right? That's the idea that we're trying to present here, or at least I'm trying to talk about in this video. But a lot of times, there are flexible options that can make you stronger. So for example, if we're looking at a Marksman Vanguard board, how can we make this board stronger late game, right? Is 4 marks, for example, 4 Marksman is super essential, so you can't really drop 4 Marksman. Without 4 Vanguard, a lot of times your front line is super unstable. So a lot of times you're trying to find something, either a small synergy that can help build or something that plays into the synergies, like an Aurora, for example, that can make use of Anima and also activate Dynamo. That would be a way to spike your board late game. These are obvious examples. We'll go into a little bit more detail. The idea is that you usually want to find some sort of option that can make you stronger, and this can be something like, Vanguard Marksman is very well defined, but there's lots of other comps where you actually have to ask that question quite a bit, and it's a lot more of a meaningful question that comes down to like the types of units you have, the upgrades, the items that you have for them. A lot of times these are specific to the comp that you are playing, so I also on my channel, I'm not trying to shill a bunch, but just in case you're wondering, I do guides on how to play certain comps to the best of my knowledge, and I talk about the spikes that these comps can have and how they kind of work and why they would work the way that they do. So if you want to see something like particular, like for example, how do I spike in a street demon comp or something like that, there's probably a guide that I already have done or talked about in one of the previous videos, but that's just something to look out for. But anyways, in terms of ways to spike, there's many different types of spikes. We talked about a couple of them already, but usually what you're looking for is a threshold for a synergy. The synergies help out your carries or your front line. You're going to have frontline synergies, backline synergies, or you're going to have team-wide synergies that can help you out. And usually there is a threshold that is considered the majority spike for the board. For example, 4 Vanguard, 4 Marksman, that spike is 4 Vanguard and 4 Marksman. If you have 2 Vanguard, you still have room to improve. If you have 2 Marksman, you still have room to improve, for example. A lot of times, if you're playing reroll, hitting your 3 stars is a massive spike. So here we're talking about Vanguard Marksman. We can equivalently talk about a reroll style comp. Let's just take Twisted Fate, because that's like one of the bread and butter reroll lines, right? With this comp, a lot of times, your spikes or your big power spikes are going to be when you hit Twisted Fate 3 and when you hit Braum 3, and then a lot of times when you hit Draven 3-star. Hitting the 3-star unit is going to be a way that your board improves dramatically. Additionally, there's 5 costs, which we talked about a little bit before. Some comps spike really hard off of 5 costs. Some comps you just put them in as an extra unit that can help out your entire board. One example that I talked about before was the amp board. A lot of times this amp board, it can feel very temperamental at certain stages in the game because there is such a large gap, such a large spike between hitting the 4 amp, which they made a little bit better this patch. Don't get me wrong, they buffed 4 amp. Or they try to rework it a little bit, like reduce HP, give more of the amp synergy, so it's a little bit better, but like there is still a very noticeable spike when you hit Samira with this comp. It makes the comp very top heavy. It makes it very like, you know, angled towards fast 9 a lot of times, or having a really good reroll spot that you can hit the units and still reach the Samira. That's just a rough example, by the way, not something that I'm going to say 100% of the time. I did an amp guide if you're more curious about it on my channel. Then there's also Divinicorp. So something that's often not mentioned or not talked about that much is when you have units that just on their own give your whole team a buff. For example, let's just take a Renekton. Renekton, while he is a 5 cost and he has his own abilities and he can do his own stuff, Divinicorp as a trait gives your whole team some sort of stat bonus. So if you're playing a team that has a particularly good use for one of these stats, like AP or armor or HP, a lot of times this is something you can just shove on your board and it will improve your board by just giving you a lot of resources. One of the best examples of a Divinicorp that you should often look towards in order to spike your board a little bit, it might not be a powerful spike, but something that can help you out, is Gragas. Gragas, if you can activate Bruiser, you get 100 HP on your whole board. That's one of those types of synergies that just helps out a little bit. But also, his Divinicorp bonus is just 60 HP on your whole board. So no matter what level you are, just getting 60 HP on all your units is pretty good. Or sorry, 50, excuse me. Just getting 50 HP on all your units, that's pretty good. Just everybody gets a little bit of HP, makes your whole board a little bit harder to take down. That's just a way of taking a lower cost unit, shoving them on your board, and having some level of spiking your board or improving your board in some way. One thing that I want to say, I make this joke a lot, and I talk about it a lot in some of my other guides when I'm talking about optimizations. Don't get emotionally attached to the pixels. I say it kind of jokingly, but basically the idea that I'm trying to present here is that you should always look at a unit. Look at the units on your board and decide, is that unit weak? If that unit isn't really doing anything, don't get attached to playing that unit on your board. That's something that really comes into mind a lot of times, and we'll talk about some examples of this. But for example, you know what? Let's give a rough example right now. A common optimization is with Vex with Exotech, and I'll talk about it in a second. So Vex with Exotech, for example, this is a board that has a lot of wiggle room that you can actually improve and make really strong very effectively. And the reason is that there's a lot of units here that kind of don't do anything in certain situations. Of course, there are some situations where they're like super useful and super helpful. Missing somebody, Morgana, right? This is usually your Vex Exotech board. You play 5 Exotech, you play Vex with Divinicorp. Like a lot of these units, they could be replaced or improved upon by putting higher cost counterparts in place of them. For example, the units that come to mind a lot of times are Jhin and this Jax unit, for example. Now, we're going to talk about this board in more detail, so don't get, you know, all hyped up if you don't agree right now, because I'm going to explain it when you drop these units. But don't get attached to that it has to be 5 Exotech. There are situations, especially if your 5th Exotech item, your 5 Exotech item here isn't particularly good for your board, then you want to try and replace them with high cost units. A lot of times you'll see optimizations where people will play, you know, Aurora and Renekton over these units, because you're just replacing them with higher cost units to give you better buffs. Aurora can summon a whole extra unit. Renekton, if you have items for him, could do a lot of damage and plays into the Divinicorp synergy, so you get some extra Divinicorp bonuses. So the HP that you lose for Exotech and the Exotech item, if those aren't particularly useful, these units are not units that you're playing for any sort of value. You're playing them for the synergy, and if the synergy isn't helping you out that much, like it's not super useful, then replacing them with better units is going to help you out. And this is going to extend to many different comps. We're just going to talk about this one because there is like a very clear you know, optimization path that I think a lot of you are more familiar with, that we can talk about in more depth. But that's like an idea that I'm trying to present. Additionally, if a synergy is not helping, replace it. They usually go hand in hand, but a lot of times you're playing a lot of low cost units as a synergy that helps buff your board or helps buff your entire units, or playing deep into the synergy just to get the extra stats that it gives you. But if that synergy isn't super helpful, if you don't want to activate random synergies just to light up the left side of your screen. It doesn't matter if you have a lot of like synergies lit up. It's a matter of, are the synergies you have in actually supporting the units that want to have those synergies, your main carry and your main tank. So a lot of times it takes evaluation, and you can learn this just by like, playing the comps a lot, following guides, like understanding your build paths and stuff like that. But I also would like people, especially if you watch videos on my channel, I always try and present ideas in a way that you can kind of apply them your own way and then kind of figure it out for yourself, because TFT is complex, and a lot of times that's something that you have to do and you don't always have the answer to everything. So the idea is, look at your units, understand, are they weak, is the synergy useful, and why do I have these units in, and are they actually benefiting my board? And think about it every single turn, pay attention to your damage numbers, and try and replace them if they're not doing that well. That's a big idea of optimization. Of course, if you also hit some sort of giga unit, giga units I'm usually referring to, like, you hit some 5 cost or some 5 cost upgrade a lot of the time. They're likely better than something. So, try and use your critical ideas here. Like, if you have a low cost unit that isn't doing too much, usually replacing it for a higher cost unit is going to be something that's beneficial. But of course, pay attention to your game. Let's talk about like some general rule of thumbs now. So these are all going to be some examples. I'm actually going to blaze through a bunch of them, and it's just going to be talking about optimizations in terms of like different ways of viewing it, as well as different ways to optimize different boards. Gold investment is something that's really important to think about. So sometimes in TFT we don't really think about it too much, but gold investment is usually how TFT is not, it's not inherently balanced this way. Of course, I'm not a dev, I can't tell you how it's balanced, but a lot of times when the game becomes very balanced, the idea of gold investment is something that matters a lot. The idea is that certain units cost different amounts, right? You have 1 cost units, 2 cost units, 3 cost units, 4 cost units, 5 cost units. The idea is that based on the cost of the unit, that's kind of like a little bit of a gauge on how effective they are at doing certain things. That's why 4 cost and 5 cost units are often hallmarks of being really strong, especially when upgraded, because they have better abilities, they have better ults, they have better stats, they have better abilities to actually do either more tanking or more damage. They're just better units. And the idea is that there's like a gold investment principle, right? A lot of times if you're spending a lot of money or a lot of gold on low cost units, that's fine, but they eventually get outscaled by the high cost units. For example, this Urgot costs 5 gold. This Morgana costs 1 gold. Maybe it's a little bit awkward, so let's just pick like units that are a little bit more similar in terms of their types of damage to make it a little bit easier. Let's say Kindred. Here, we'll use Kindred and Urgot as an example. Kindred is a 1 cost unit, right? She is 1 gold that you get early in the game, right? A Kindred 2-star is 3 gold. This Urgot is 5 gold. Even an upgraded Kindred, this Urgot is going to be almost twice the value of that unit. Equivalently, let's take a 2 cost unit. A 2 cost unit like Twisted Fate. Twisted Fate is 2 gold, right? A 2-star Twisted Fate is 6 gold. This Urgot is 5 gold. He is almost the same price as this Twisted Fate. So obviously if you have an Urgot 1, he's not going to be better than some synergies, not going to be better than some boards, and it's going to take some work, especially without items. If you don't have items that are good for him, you can't just slot in any unit in place of anything else. I'm not saying that's how it is. That's obviously not how TFT works, but something that you can use to help you evaluate is you can look at the unit and say to yourself, this unit is extremely expensive. There's a good chance that they outscale a lot of these other units. That's why, the hallmark of a high cap board is usually a 2-star 5 cost. A 2-star 5 cost costs 15 gold. 15 gold is so much more than a lot of units. A 2-star 5 cost will often do more damage or do equivalent as much damage as a 3-star 1 cost. It's just a way of optimizing the board. Sometimes if you go for a reroll strategy, you're more playing into like your early game tempo rather than your late game tempo, and that's why. Because these high cost units, especially when you upgrade them, they just do more. And part of that is built into the fact that, if they didn't do more, then they shouldn't cost as much. And if they don't cost as much, they shouldn't be like high level units, and that's just the whole point of it. But that's like an idea of evaluating your boards. And think about units you want to remove. If you have like random frontline units that aren't contributing to certain synergies, upgrading them for higher cost versions of units is going to be a way to optimize that board, unless they're giving you some really, really critical synergy that you need for your carry. A lot of times you can alternate or replace them with other units that will do more. So this Kindred, for example, is going to fall off. It's not worth it to have a Kindred 3 a lot of the times, unless you're like, even if you're playing within Marksman or Rapid Fire, unless you have like, you know, no other options, or you're playing strictly a reroll line that makes good use of it. A lot of times, like, using that gold on a higher cost unit is just going to be more efficient use of that gold in some cases. But that's like an idea to present that you guys can think about a little bit. So now let's think about what my comp wants. So I say a brief overview for most comps. I'm not going to go over all the comps. I'm just going to go over one or two of them, or a couple of them. These are similar to some of the ones that I talked about in terms of ranked climbing, but I'm just going to go through like a couple of the main carries of 4 costs and just talk about it. So the first one that I want to talk about was Marksman Vanguard, which we talked about a little bit. But with Marksman Vanguard, so when you're thinking about optimizing the board, there's certain things that you pretty much never cut, and that is the 4 Marksman trait. The 4 Marksman trait, whenever you're playing around either a Xayah carry or a Felios carry, or if you're rerolling some sort of like awkward, like off like meta style line between Jinx or Jhin or even Kindred, you always want to have 4 Marksman in because it's just super efficient. The scaling that you get with the AD from 4 Marksman compared to 2 Marksman is just so powerful, and they even buffed it. I'm pretty sure they buffed it, unless they reverted it, but from the last time I looked at the patches, they buffed it as well. It's extremely powerful, so a lot of times you always want to have 4 Marksmen in because it makes your carries much more efficient. So even if this Jinx and this Jhin, they still do something, right? Even if they're low cost units, they're still going to do some work, but you don't want to replace the Jinx or the Jhin with anything else, because if you're playing with items on Aphelios, items on Xayah, these are your primary carries, which is what you usually do with this Marksman board, then you need to have the 4 Marksmen in, because it does so much extra damage on these 2 units that it will stabilize you a lot more effectively. So that's typically what ends up happening with this type of board. And then of course, with the Vanguards, you usually want to have 4 Vanguard in, because your comp is extremely reliant on this Leona being like almost like a solo tank, or being extremely tanky to stall out for your backline. So if you drop these units, even if you have like, you know, 5 cost frontline units, without the 4 Vanguard, those frontline units have to have a lot of items in order to make sure that you have an effective frontline. Usually because you're itemizing Aphelios and Xayah, you don't have enough items for frontline, 2 tanks, and backline many tanks, so then you end up having to play 4 Vanguard by default, because if you don't, the Leona's not going to tank enough, and you likely don't have enough items to itemize 2 tanks and 2 backline units. So that's kind of how that board works out. The next board that I want to talk about, just going in order, I'm going in order of 4 costs here. We're not going to talk too much about reroll lines, just because like I'm more of a 4 costs. Like, I think it's easier to discuss this with 4 costs and optimizing, because rerolls are usually more flushed out anyways, and I think those ones are harder to drop units. But let's talk about Brand. So Brand, for example, a lot of times you're playing Street Demon. Now, Street Demon looks really weird because you would think that you can drop some of the Street Demon units. With Brand, you almost always want to play 8 Street Demon. The main reason why you're always playing 8 Street Demon... Oh, sorry, I'll drop Rengar. I'll put Jinx in. It looks more like this. The reason you're always playing 7 Street Demon is because the stat bonuses that you get from 7 Street Demon makes your whole board relatively tanky. So all of these units that are low cost units, yes, this Mundo is going to get outscaled by other units. Yes, this Echo is going to get outscaled by other units. But with 7 Street Demon, you're not only getting effective AD and AP that works really well on your backline units to do damage, they're also getting inherent tankiness, which actually is a lot more beneficial than some of the other traits that you would fit in. So a lot of times when you're optimizing this board, you don't want to drop the 7 Street Demon. That's how it is right now. Of course, if they make 7 Street Demon more nerfed, or they buff 5 Street Demon, you might optimize it by doing something else. It's just right now that it's very effective, and it's really hard to drop down the units because so many of them have interlaced synergies. So you have Echo and Nico that share strategists, so now you're getting your main tank and extra synergy, and then you have Zyra and Brand both being techie, so you have an extra synergy there. And then just playing these extra units is not super expensive, but it's a good way to just round out your board with a lot of extra stats. In terms of other lines you can play, for example, we're going to talk about the Vex board now. And I think this will be the last example, but this one's going to be a little bit more complicated. So the Vex board, a lot of times there are different things that matter a lot. With Vex in particular, usually you're playing her with Exotech. There are lines where you play like a fast 9, you play like Bruiser, Vex, Urgot, but that's a very high cap fast 9 board, which we'll talk more about when we're talking about optimizing this line a little bit. But if we're talking about things that matter for this particular comp, a lot of times it comes down to your Exotech items. Usually you end up playing 5 Exotech. with your 5 Exotech, I'm just going to put all the items that kind of matter. You're usually looking for one Varus item, because usually your Exotech items are split damage and tank item. You want one Varus item, which is either going to be Hyper Fangs or it's going to be Hollow Bow. So one of these 2 items for Varus, and then one of the Exotech tank items that you put on either on Sejuani or Mordekaiser. And those ones are going to be the green, the blue, and the purple. So you want one of each of these, right? So you want one frontline and one backline item. Namely, you typically like to have at least one frontline item, because you're going to have a lot of backline damage with the Vex. When you're looking for 5 Exotech, you want to have one of these 2 items. If you have other items, this comp is pretty mid and not so great, and a lot of times Exotech doesn't become as important, especially if you're playing around Vex. Something like Pulse Stabilizer or Flux Capacitor. These are items that don't make great value with your particular board, or as good value with what you're playing. But if you have these 2 items, it's really efficient to play 5 Exotech. Playing 5 Exotech gives you HP on all your Exotech units, so it makes them inherently tanky, and it also gives you 2 items, which helps with your item economy, because you're going to be able to more easily itemize your front line and your back line and have multiple carries and multiple tanks, because you have 2 extra items on your board. Additionally, when you're playing this, you usually fit in Divinicorp. So a lot of times it's something that people get a little bit confused about sometimes. Not confused about. This is like a point of discussion occasionally. But Gragas, really good, because obviously it's very obvious, because he's Bruiser, he gives Bruiser synergy, and he has Divinicorp bonus, which gives Bruiser. Morgana is a 1-cost unit. So a lot of times you would think to yourself, I can just drop Morgana, because who cares about Morgana? You usually never drop Morgana when you're playing this Vex comp. The reason people play Morgana is basically like threefold. Divinicorp, so you get extra bonuses on all your Divinicorp units, by which you are playing a couple of them. You're playing 3, so you're going to get more HP, you're going to get more crit, and you're going to get more AP for your entire board. The second thing is that Morgana is a really good way to optimize this board, because when you think about your backline, Varus and Vex, what are they? They are executioners. What are executioners? They have their abilities crit. So these units have their abilities crit already. If you're trying to scale up your damage and your abilities already crit, the main ways to scale up your damage are with more damage amp or more base stats. Base AP goes a long way, because now if your ults are always going to be critting, your ults are going to do more damage if you scale that up with AP. So if you have base AP, you have something to multiply with that critical strike. Morgana giving AP as her Divinicorp bonus is extremely powerful, because you're playing around 2 AP backline carries that both scale immensely well with extra AP. And Vex is a very item hungry unit, because if you think about her items, she's kind of forced to always have blue buff Nashers, right? So where is it? Like usually you need a casting item on her, it's always going to be blue buff, and then because of her ability, you'll always need to have Gunblade on her. So she's actually a little bit starved for AP, because a lot of times when you want to give her damage amp, so you usually give her guard breaker, it gives her crit chance and damage amp. So this Morgana is like one of the only ways to like giga scale this unit besides like augments. So that's also a benefit of Morgana. And the last thing that Morgana gives you is also Dynamo. Dynamo is insanely good. It just gives mana to your whole board. What does your board want? This whole board wants mana. Like every single one of these units wants to have more mana, right? If you think about Sejuani, what's one of Sejuani's most important items? If you don't know already, it's Protector's Vow. Protector's Vow is so insanely important on Sejuani just to make sure that she gets her first cast off. But giving extra mana to everybody is really beneficial. Vex as well. She can sometimes chain cast and just do 2 explosive hits one after another without giving the opponent a chance to heal or like reposition their tanks or do anything like that. A lot of times the extra mana that you get from the Dynamo trait can help these 2 units get their casts off a couple more times and sway a fight dramatically. 2 Dynamo in this comp is insanely strong, and a lot of times when you're optimizing even further, you play deeper into the Dynamo trait just to give the extra mana to your unit so they just pump out more damage. So when you think about this Morgana unit, that's the deficit of dropping it. You lose all 3 of those explanations I gave you. That's why Morgana became something that optimized this line a lot. Before, like, you know, Morgana wasn't always played with Vex, but when people were optimizing this certain Exotech line, you know, whoever it was who first came up with it is a genius, but now we've come to know that Morgana is extremely important in this comp, and you almost always have to play her. There's very few times that you drop her. These are examples of like understanding the comp really well, because even if the unit itself, that's what I was saying before, like, you know, evaluate your board, but Also evaluate what that unit provides. Morgana being a 1 cost for this particular board gives you so many important things that it's almost always a good idea to play Morgana and not to replace the Morgana even though she's a 1 cost. Now of course, you know, if you have a Morgana and you have like an Aurora 2-star, you might consider to replace the Morgana in those cases, but you still lose the AP and the Divinicore bonuses, so it's just usually not worth it. Even for high cost units, you usually just end up replacing something else on your board, which we'll talk about in a second of like late game optimizations with that particular board. Another thing with optimizing is, should I roll more? This is a question I get a lot, and I talked about it a little bit with some reroll lines in some previous guides when I was talking about rerolls. But in general, when you're playing reroll lines, one of the optimizations or one of the ways to spike your board is to hit the 3 stars of the unit. So for example, if we are considering a board that looks like this, and we're just considering our Twisted Fate, for example, it really depends on the reroll line, but what I always recommend to people is always make sure that when you're playing a reroll, you have at least 1 3-star backline unit and 1 3-star frontline unit. It's very rare that you don't want to have a 3-star version of a frontline and a backline unit, because often you just won't be able to scale well enough with that particular comp. For example, with Twisted Fate, you would want to keep rolling if you don't have Twisted Fate 3 or you don't have Braum 3. Now, in certain situations, it does depend, because you could level to fit in more synergies. You could level to fit in some higher cost units that might help out your board, you know, push levels, play a 5 cost. It becomes more of a question when you have multiple other units. For example, if you're playing this board and you have, you know, Darius and Rost, and you have Draven, then it becomes a little bit more complicated. And a lot of times, hitting the 3-star comes down to how many items you have. I wouldn't really care about hitting Darius 3 with this comp ever if you're going for the version that you roll on level 7. A lot of times you roll on level 7, you go for Draven 3, you go for Braum 3. It's really efficient because on level 7, you don't really need to level for anything else, because a lot of times you're playing this board. It looks something like and then like Shaco, I think. Let's go like this, right? Like this is a board that fits in really nicely on level 8. But a lot of times when you're playing on level 7, you usually have to drop one of these units and you play something that looks kind of like this. And it's okay, right? But what I'm trying to say is that, you know, you're pretty complete on level 7, so you usually just stay on level 7 and roll. But I wouldn't spend too much gold to roll for other units unless I have items for them. A lot of times, hitting the Twisted Fate 3 is really good. Hitting the Braum 3 is really good. If you're very far away from Draven, at that point, you might just have to push levels in order to better your front line, because you can easily level with this comp for a Gragas on level 8, and it spikes your board significantly because the 2 Bruiser plus the Divinicore bonus, you basically get like an extra 150 HP on your entire board, which, you know, added up, that's a lot of extra HP for your board. It's going to put a lot more pressure on your opponents to do damage. But if you're lacking the 3-star units, like if you're lacking damage, for example, and your front line is stable, leveling won't make sense here. You'd rather go for the Draven 3, because then you just increase your damage dramatically by having the Draven 3. Additionally, if you don't have front line, you might want to then push level for the front line. A big portion of this comes down to your items, however. This is the point I was trying to get at. If you don't have items for units, it doesn't matter if you 3-star them. That's a really important concept that I tried to explain in some of my other videos. But if you have a 3-star unit, for example, if I just make this guy 3-star, what does it really do? What does 3-star Ross do if he doesn't have items? Nothing. He does nothing. Because he'll scale up his HP a little bit, yes. He'll scale up his armor a little bit, yes. But like, you can equivalently just get the same amount of HP and armor on your whole board by just leveling for Gragas. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not that important and it's not that massive of a buff unless you have items to scale those abilities, right? A 3-star with a stronger ability and, you know, items to support that is going to be exponentially better. So a lot of times when you're playing reroll lines, don't get too caught up on hitting every single 3-star. Focus on one front line, one back line, and then evaluate. If you're close to another one, go for it. And if you have items for it, go for it. But if you don't have items for it and you're not close to it, then a lot of times it's better to push levels, get extra synergies in, play for higher cost units, try and get some like 5 cost in that can really spread some extra damage. Even like a Zac, for example, that can help out with your front line. Things like that will go a long way, as opposed to staying low level and just trying to make everybody look golden. That's like the main idea that I want to talk about there. Next, let's talk about unit transitions. So this is something that it's very obvious in certain comps, but I just wanted to show it a little bit here. But when I talk about unit transitions, a lot of times when you're playing around certain comps, it's okay to make items for a unit in the future, so long as you have an item holder in the first place. This is really important with Street Demon. A lot of times when you're playing Street Demon, your board looks something like this, and then on level 8, you usually play something else. Sometimes it's a strategist, sometimes it's a bruiser. Let's just assume that, you know, we'll go old school and we'll say Ziggs. There's other ways to play this comp on level 8. You can play like a Cho'Gath, you can play like what's it called, a Gragas as well. Like, there's lots of different units you can slot in, but let's just assume we're playing this variation with 3 strategists. When you're playing this comp works really well if you make your solid AP items for brand. And then a lot of times what you end up doing is trying to itemize another unit. It makes a lot of sense when you're playing Street Demon to make either double AP items. For example, if we're playing Ziggs, then you can put your AP items on the Ziggs, right? It's a very item hungry comp, but a lot of times what people will do, which is a little bit more of a risky strat, but it's playing more towards an optimization, is to make items for Jinx. So what you end up doing is you make your AD items on a Jinx. Now the Jinx too is going to be really strong, and she's going to do a lot of damage and do great things, but the idea is with the intention of a late game unit transition. What you can do with these items is eventually transfer them onto a Samira. So a lot of times when you're playing around a comp and you're itemizing a lower cost unit, you should always think about a high cost counterpart that can then use those items effectively. So in this case, I'm making AD items, not because Jinx is going to be my solo carry. It's more so that if you have AD items with this comp, you can put them on Samira and then late game transition the items, or sorry, put them on Jinx and then late game transition them to the Samira. This works really well with different vertical traits because a lot of times the vertical traits will have like an alternating AP, AD, AP, AD, carry or tank based on like the cost, right? A similar example is in Anima Squad. Anima Squad isn't super popular right now, but sometimes with Anima Squad, you know, you might be playing it from a spot where you're starting with a Seraphine. Well, Seraphine is an AP unit. Okay, that's cool. Then you might hit a Vayne, right? The Vayne is a 2 cost. So what's the 2 cost unit? The 2 cost alternates. The 2 cost is going to be, let me just clear board actually. I'll make it a little bit easier to show you what I mean. But let's say, you know, we're playing Anima. I'll show the example with Anima as well. Let's say we're playing Anima, right? Anima, you might start out with a Seraphine. Seraphine is an AP unit. Okay, so you might make AP items and say, okay, well, I'm playing around AP. The next cost unit is usually Vayne. Well, what is Vayne? Vayne is an AD unit. Okay, so we'll play AD. Okay, so what's the 3 cost unit? The 3 cost is an AP unit. Okay, so now we can transition those items onto the higher cost unit that's going to do a little bit more damage. Oh, what's this? The next unit is an AP. You see the trend I'm trying to show you? That's how a lot of the traits are usually designed. And then obviously your high cap is going to be AP with Aurora, and then you can put the AP items on the Aurora. The idea is that like you can build mixed items for your comp with the intention of putting it on a higher cost unit later, but it's not like, you know, essential. It's just an idea of optimizing around it, right? The Aurora in this case is obviously going to be better than the Yumi, but this is very obvious because the trait is designed in such a way, like Anima Squad. There are other comps that are more complicated, obviously, that might not work in a similar way. A good example is Boombot, right? Boombot is really hard to play around, in my opinion, because like it's hard to like see these transitions and see who can be your item holders from late game to early game to mid game. But you run a similar concept, right? Your highest cap usually is going to be itemizing towards a lot of the 5 cost units. So as long as you can build items with an intention in the future, find a good item holder while you're still low level, and then swap them onto high cost units later. And those are like late game transitions that you can try and perform for different comps. Additionally, something that's really powerful is to add a Divinicorp unit. Sorry, I just flickered the slide. But adding a Divinicorp unit is very powerful, as we mentioned before. All the Divinicorp units give bonuses. We talked a lot about Morgana, but it goes without saying that a lot of these units can work really well. If you're looking for any particular stat, even if it's not the most optimal thing, technically the stats aren't that much. I think Divinicorp, unless you're playing deep into Divinicorp, it doesn't give that many stats, so don't get too caught up on it. But if you're looking for a unit to just shove onto your board and give yourself a stat, Divinicorp is something that can help you with that. No matter what your level is, just throwing in a Divinicorp is going to give your whole team a buff, right? Whether it be armor, whether it be HP, whether it be attack speed, whether it be AP, whether it be crit chance, or whether it be AD. So a lot of times, depending on what the unit is or what your board is, you have to identify, is this really important? We talked about the bonuses being really important for Vex, for example. In the Vex comp of why Morgana is super critical, it might not be as obvious with other comps, but it is a way to spike your board that you can look towards optimizing it in some way. And finally, we're going to talk about 5 costs additions or transitions to 5 cost late game. So the example that we're going to give for this one is the Vex board. So this is a transition that is very popular, but what I was saying before, I'm going to explain in more detail now. Jax and Jhin, a lot of times are dropped with this comp if you're trying to optimize it well towards late game. And late game, usually you play some rendition of extra units. Usually it's some form of Renekton, Urgot, Viego, Zac, Aurora, right? These are all like pretty good units that can slot in pretty nicely. Technically, the ones that you usually see played the most is going to be Aurora and Renekton as counterparts to the the Jhin and the Jax, excuse me. So what you do a lot of times is you drop these 2 units and you replace them with higher cost counterparts. We already talked that you usually don't want to drop Morgana for obvious reasons. Now, what do you lose by transitioning to these? Whenever you transition out of a certain trait, a lot of times it makes it really awkward late game because those traits are something that you're making as your foundation that supports your units. So for example, if you drop from 5 exotech down to 3 exotech, you are losing 100 HP per item on all of your units that are exotech that have items. So a lot of times you're losing a lot of HP on your board, which is pretty detrimental, and you're losing an entire exotech item. This late game transition, it makes a lot of sense if your exotech items aren't good. So for example, if you don't have a Varus item and you have only a Sejuani item, or vice versa, you only have a Varus item and you don't have a Sejuani item. If you only have one of these 2 sets of items, then it makes sense to drop them because the exotech item is useless. So 5 exotech doesn't matter because the exotech item is useless. You don't have to worry about it. And then the HP deficit, a lot of it could be made up by just playing higher cost units. The HP deficit, Jax is a low cost unit, Jhin is a low cost unit. These units are going to be overwhelmed if you have like a 2-star Renekton, 2-star Aurora. A lot of times the 5 costs just have so many more stats that it makes more sense to put them in, and you can sometimes drop the synergies. In this case, because like I said, this is usually only if the exotech item is bad. If the exotech item is good, you have less of a reason to do this, and you have to be a little bit more critical of who has items. But if you don't need the exotech item and you're just playing them for the extra HP, it makes sense because you can make up that HP with Renekton. Aurora summons an entire other unit to the board. That whole other unit is definitely going to make up the extra HP, because if you're talking about 100 HP per item, if you summon a unit that has 1,000 plus HP on your board, we're good, right? We're good. We made up the difference in HP. And what we're getting in return is a unit that can do more damage, units with more powerful abilities, Divinicore bonus, which is really powerful. So this is the idea of late game transitions with 5 cost units, and it works really well with this Vex comp, and is why it's one of the highest cap comps in the game. Additionally, this comp is really good if you have a lot of items, because obviously if you have 2-star 5 cost with no items, it's the same as like having a 3-star with no items. They're not going to be as effective. They still do a lot because they're 5 cost, but they're not going to do as much. But if you end up with a lot of items, for example, if you have items to slam on Aurora, or if you have items to slam on this Renekton, they can actually pop off and become the new carries for your comp. They might do more damage than Vex or the whole board that you structure in the first place, because they are so immensely strong in terms of their scaling and their ability. They're made to outscale a lot of the comps in the game because they are those expensive units. Additionally, there's lots of other things you can add in for free with many other comps, right? If we're talking about, our classic Vanguard Marksman, right? Let's go back to it, just because I like talking about this one. I always try and make similar examples throughout my videos, so it's kind of like coherent if you watch a lot of them. I'm not saying any of these comps are particularly the most broken in the game. These are just like common comps that you're probably going to be playing on your rank up journey, so that's why I'm using them as examples. And it's also easy to explain. You're like, there's some that are more specific and awkward, so I want to make sure that it's like, coherent message. So don't get it mixed, like, Vanguard isn't the greatest comp in the game, but it's just an example. There's 2 5 costs that come to mind a lot, and that is Zac and Garen. These are units that can usually slot in on almost any board, so long as you hit them early enough. If you hit Zac early enough, he is arguably the best 5 cost in the game, because at one point, if you get enough blobs, it is just a guaranteed win. But barring somebody hitting like 10 anima or 10 street demon or some crazy shit, if you get to like 30 or 40 blobs with Zac, he will just tank and do more damage than most units in the game. He is just insanely strong if you get to that point. Similarly, Garen can spread synergies to your comp, but both of these rely you having them early in the game. But if you take a comp like this that's very complete on a level 8 and you can easily make it to level 9, finding one of these units early can scale your comp well into late game that will actually put you in a win condition comp. This comp that might be like a little bit like cheesy, not super strong, you know, like not as flashy or crazy as some of the other ones, more of like a level 8 style comp, could dramatically get altered by some of these really powerful abilities that can scale really well into future rounds late into the game. Additionally, just finding any unit that can slot into your board is really nice. A lot of times you play Aurora. Aurora does two things, right? Aurora allows you to drop the synergy that this Silas provides, right? Silas, similar to Morgana, provides multiple effects, right? Anima Squad, Vanguard, things that you want to have on your board. So he's very efficient as a spot, because losing him, you lose a lot of value. But if you find an Aurora, Aurora gives Dynamo, and it frees up the spot to play a higher cost Vanguard unit that's going to be more tanky. Somebody like a Braum, for example, that can make a little bit better use of that space. So these are ways to optimize the board, right? If you can replace that unit's synergies and the effects that they add, by all means, replace them. You know what I mean? Find a higher cost unit. Don't get emotionally attached to it, right? Find a higher cost unit that does the same job, and it'll probably do a little bit better on your board. But anyways, that's the video that I want to do for today. Thanks for watching. Hopefully it was enjoyable. One last thing before we all go. I'm going to make a poll on my Discord. Not on my Discord. I'm going to make a poll on the YouTube community tab. Just ask about when I should do the item guide. Giving the new information, there's going to be a big item change. I made the video about it yesterday, talking about it, reacting. I was going to make my item guides, you know, today and the day before, but I'm postponing it at least until next week, because I haven't decided if I should do them yet or not, because I don't want them to be irrelevant after a week. I could just wait until the next patch to do the item guide, so I'm going to make a poll about that. So stay tuned. If you're really interested in like shaping the content and like that matters to you, check it out. And just vote if you want me to delay them or just release them earlier, because they're ready to go. But either way, thanks for watching. Have a great day and see ya. Bye-bye.